We're delighted to welcome you, Professor Andrea Pető, to the University of Sheffield. You're here with us to present at our event, The Future of Gender in the Curriculum, Opportunities and Threats, a question that very much occupies your research and your activism. It's delightful to be able to welcome you as a guest of the HRI Catalyze series and as a guest of the Faculty Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Committee as well. So again, these are areas of the curriculum and areas of our activism that apply very closely to your own interests. So Professor Pető, you are a professor of gender studies at the CEU in Budapest, and you come at a very important time and a very kind of threatening time in the history of and the experience of your university. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that, about your experience of teaching gender studies and being on the front lines of activism as an advocate for gender studies in Hungary and throughout Europe?
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm extremely happy to be here. And you see I'm wearing this button, which is the button which is proliferated all over in the world because CEU is now under attack. Academic freedom is under attack. And this button has been worn by our alumni, our supporters all over the world who are actually concerned about what's happening with CEU. The government passed an amendment to the higher educational law which made it impossible for CEU to operate, and now when CEU with all difficulties complied with that regulation, now the government extended the deadline of that amendment. It means that for another year we are in a kind of uncertain limbo situation, and it means that we will have a very interesting and important 1 year ahead of us, which makes it even more difficult that we have got upcoming elections in spring. So please, those who are viewing this film, please watch out for us.
Absolutely, and you certainly have the support of a number of my colleagues, and those who know about what's going on are very concerned for you and for the CEU and of course for the wider academic community, because it has implications far further afield as well. I wanted to, and of course it has extra implications for you, not only as a member of staff and a professor at CEU, but particularly as a professor of gender studies, which is one area of the curriculum, which is one area of the offerings that is under particular threat because of its assumed political positioning and its positionality, as you say. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about your own background in gender studies, how you emerged as an academic, as a scholar, as a historian within the field of gender studies, how it reflects your own kind of life experience, and how that life experience has motivated your activism.
Thank you. That's a very nice question, and that actually demonstrates that how actually teaching and research can be a political activism. And also when you think that you are just a normal professor working in an ivory tower, suddenly history knocks on your door, and then you find yourself in the middle of a very important political battle which will actually influence the future not only of gender studies, not only humanities, but basically science as such. So let me elaborate on this. Because I'm a historian who was basically trained in Germany and also here in England, and then I became a normal kind of social historian, but always worked on women's history and gender history. And I was appointed as a professor of gender studies like 4 years ago by the President of Hungary, and I'm actually the first professor in Hungary who gets this title, and also at CEU I have my professorship. And suddenly we found ourselves, those who are working in gender studies and the gender studies department, found ourselves in a kind of very problematic political situation. Previously we were constantly complaining that nobody is paying attention, we are trying to mainstream but we fail. And also gender studies departments in Europe, they are either in the attic or in the cellar, and at CEU our department is in the attic. And suddenly we have got all these press inquiries and interview requests and whatever because gender and gender studies became a forefront in fighting for academic freedom and equality, and also for the right to have a kind of balanced and solid academic research. These anti-gender movements, let's call it the name, right? We are talking about those anti-gender movements, which are actually, it's a global movement. It's not only happening in Eastern Europe, it's a global phenomenon, but it really depends on the certain national context where this kind of movement, what kind of strengths and what kind of triggers are there. And you were asking about my personal story. So I have got this dubious honor that in 2008, when I was publishing with colleagues a secondary history textbook about the history of men and women in Hungary in the 20th century, I received a phone call from a friend that an appeal was submitted in the Hungarian parliament that this textbook, which is a very solid textbook for secondary level education, is spreading the so-called culture of death. And when I got this phone call, I thought, you know, there is something wrong here, because I'm teaching a course on gender and politics, so I know that this kind of language is coming from the Vatican and also from this kind of fundamentalist Christian circles. But how come this term actually popped up in the Hungarian parliament in 2008? And by all means, I mean, in relation to my textbook. So that was actually the beginning in the Hungarian context, where the anti-gender movement started attacking gender studies, attacking the inquiry related to gender, and also different rights related to gender equality.
Right. I mean, that is obviously very, very disturbing, and you find yourself, you know, at the forefront of this and at the forefront of resistance to this anti-gender movement. I want to maybe think a little bit more about the actual term gender, because are what we're talking about, is it attack on women's studies? Is it attack on women much more precisely? Is gender, using the term gender, a way of kind of diluting what is going on and giving it a diversity which might be a little bit misleading? I mean, because of course, I mean, were you possibly the victim of this attack more likely because you were a woman, or more vulnerable to that attack as a woman? I wonder how you would kind of make sense of that. Is gender the right word, or is it women's studies that's really under attack? And are these two terms interchangeable, or do we have to be careful about how we use them?
Gender in these attacks became a symbolic glue. So those who are watching this film, they are just Googling gender as symbolic glue. We actually wrote an important article and a book with this title. It means that they are actually constructing gender as a category which is gluing together certain political movements, certain attacks, and certain aspirations. So they are talking about the so-called gender ideology, which is a kind of concept. They are labeling and, you know, putting together movements, ideas, concepts, positions which never been together, but that actually serves the purpose well, because
it's progressivism, for sure.
It's a kind of progressivism, but it also glues together their side. So very often we are forgetting that we are being attacked, and sometimes, you know, colleagues in the US and also myself, we are at the targets of death threats and these kind of attacks. We are sometimes forgetting that it's also an instrument what the other side is actually using in order to consolidate their bases. So recently in Hungary there was the World Congress of Families conference, which is this Christian fundamentalist anti-choice global movement with 6,000 participants. And you see that this is an extremely heterogeneous movement, but they agree on what they think gender is. Right. And that raises the question, what kind of strategies are there to counteract this kind of attacks, and is there a possibility for a dialogue? And actually seeing this movement as a heterogeneous movement and seeing the different strands actually is more useful than trying to explain them what gender is. Because be honest, I mean, gender studies scholars themselves are, you know, discussing and debating about this, and this will not lead us, you know, further if we are not understanding that this is basically a political communication tool.
Absolutely, and it must have changed a great deal, or things have really revved up, haven't they, I assume, in the last year. What has been the impact on this anti-gender movement? How has the anti-gender movement been emboldened by the election of Donald Trump in America, and going back a few months before that to Brexit in Britain as well? Of course, these two phenomena are not without their linkages. So could you give us some reflections on that? I mean, how have things changed? How have they got probably a lot worse in the last year to 18 months?
What we have experienced with the election of Donald Trump, that those forces who believe that there should be a kind of far-right populist alternative to the neoliberal concepts and the neoliberal state, actually believe that that is actually supporting their positionality. So those ideas, those people who were previously on the fringes, I mean, there has been always a kind of fascist, alt-right, neo-Nazi, whatever you name these groups, had been always there in the fringes. What you find now, and this is a very disturbing phenomenon, that this is becoming mainstreamed. And what is even more frightening is how the conservative forces are actually courting to this kind of political ideology and applying this kind of political discourse and vocabulary with the hope that they can consolidate their political base. And you know it much better as a historian of British fascism, that basically this kind of appeasement policy is a suicidal mission. So on the one hand, when we believe that we progressives, I would say, we have got a problem, we can also say that the conservative forces, they also have a problem, because this kind of attacks and this kind of ideology, which received much support with the election of Trump, actually is eating up their basis as well. And here again, gender is an important point, because both forces, both the conservatives and the far right, are talking about family. So what this concept of family means, I mean, that is the other key concept beside gender. And let me give you another example. In the Hungarian context, CEU has been attacked, but I would say that this is not a surprise. I mean, it's very kind of unpleasant, but it's not a surprise. What is really surprising, that ELTE, which is the state-funded university, started an MA program in gender studies in Hungarian, and they immediately became a target by the different political forces. The state hasn't attacked them, but the minister who is responsible for higher education actually announced that they will be doing a family studies in MA in the University of Economics to counterbalance the MA in gender studies. And this has got two important implications. One is that they believe that family and gender are, two dichotomic terms, which is of course not the case, because there is this huge literature about, family as a social construction. And the other one is that this program will be led by one of our graduates, CEU graduates, who is a very nice colleague. So that actually gives some hope that there is a possibility for dialogue and discussion. And maybe we are not agreeing on most of the things, but there might be a discussion with conservatives about what are the major issues and what are the questions to research in the future.
Well, that's really fascinating and very important, and I'm particularly intrigued by the themes that you flagged in your last response, because of course they dovetail very much with my own areas of research: appeasement, suicide, and women on the far right. And I wanted to talk more about, or ask more about, how women are implicated in this anti-gender movement, whether this is a kind of a sex war scenario, it's men against women, or do you find that there's a significant number of women who are on the anti-gender side and who are complicit with the anti-gender agenda? There are lots of women who are participating in this movement, and of course, as a feminist and as a gender studies scholar, we are asking the question, why is this the case? And of course, if we are giving the answer that they are just have a false consciousness, or they are deplorables, to use Hillary Clinton's term, or they are just misled, I mean, these are really not describing that particular reason why they are participating in these movements. And I think that there are several reasons. One reason is that
in the past 20 years, the emancipation movement and also the different European Union directives actually promised to deliver certain form of equality, and it did not really happen. What happened is the construction of kind of very policy-oriented language, which is basically not talking about the everyday realities of those women who are now actually asking the question that who is actually taking care of the issues I have. And on the one hand, we have got the institutionalization of gender studies, but you also see that some of the issues gender studies are actually dealing with not necessarily connected with the everyday material realities. So this is one. The other reason is that this kind of liberal values, what are actually, we believe they are consensual, they turn to be not consensual. So we also have to ask the question to ourselves as educators and as activists, as citizens, that what actually went wrong, because we sometimes seem to be forgotten about the dark legacy of the European history. You research yourself that we believe that this kind of institutions and structures will actually teach people out from this. So those movements which are actually based on these hateful emotions, those who are which are racist in some extent, which are basically based on exclusion, we believe that these are, we meaning the progressive forces, we believe they are not there because there is a narrative which is actually offering a chance for voters to identify, and that is the narrative of progress. What actually turned out, and the 2008 triple crisis made it very visible, that there are cracks on this system, and how to handle those cracks will be really the kind of $1 million question for the future and for the progressive forces, if we are ready to come up with certain answers and certain narratives which are actually attracting majority of the population. And I truly believe, that gender studies has got a lot to say in this. So I just would like to underline that gender studies has really an important intellectual and political and strategic potential in the future, because we are dealing theoretically and also empirically with those issues which are everyday issues of the individuals, because the gender studies is working from bottom up. So therefore this kind of activism and scholarly engagement, what gender studies scholars are basically doing in the past 20-30 years, actually might have an impact in creating a better world after Trump.
Well, that's very hopeful, and I wanted to actually bring you out on that, draw you out on that a little bit. So what are the solutions? What can we do? What do we need to do as scholars, as those who are engaged in gender studies? What do we do in our curriculum? How do we keep gender at the forefront of our curriculum if we are, in fact, gender historians or gender scholars in other disciplines? What are we going to do now? What do we have to do? What are the solutions? What are the strategies? Give us some practical advice.
Thank you. It's a very good question. First, we have to recognize that we have a trouble. We are in a very important period when there is a paradigm change. And gender studies scholars should recognize that we are not in the 1990s anymore, but 2017 is a fundamentally new period in science, activism, in the neoliberal academia, which is the framework we are actually working in. It's always easier to say what not to do. We should not believe that if we are going to people and explain them what gender is loudly, then they will understand. That won't work. Also, what won't work is actually to repeat those mistakes what we have done. What I think should be working is asking interesting questions, writing interesting articles, trying to engage in public discussions, going out and moving out from our social media echo chamber and go out and talk to the people, participating in public discussions, going out to the media if we have got the opportunity and we are invited. So thinking about a more inviting, more open discussion, which is actually not afraid of getting into disagreements and also into debates.
I mean, I think that's great, and as many of us who can take your advice, the better. But I think the other The other concern I have is that it's a much more violent atmosphere now than it was in the 90s or at other times. I mean, from my own, from my own research and from your own research, you must find there are a lot of echoes with the 1930s and with the kind of misogyny and gendered violence that is confronting or threatening to confront women, whether they be women politicians or women academics. So, what are your words of advice? What kind of words of wisdom do you have for women who are a bit afraid about the risks that they might take in putting themselves out there for the cause?
That's a very legitimate point, because this kind of anti-gender ideology also works with threat, kind of physical and emotional threat, and that's why we need supporting networks, and that's why it's important to acknowledge that gender studies in Europe, for example, has been institutionalized, and there are supporting departments and different organizations all over in Europe. So if you look at academic gender studies, there is always the temptation to believe that we can be just another discipline, right, and we can go back to the ivory tower and write these impact factor journal articles. Unfortunately, write it out. But this is unfortunately a luxury, because we are actually under threat from two directions. One is the neoliberal academia with this impact factored kind of pressure of producing more and more 7,000 words per year, and also with this teaching load what we all have. And on the other hand, there is the anti-gender movement, which is saying that gender studies is not a discipline, it is not a science, and gender should be deleted from the curriculum. So in the case of Poland, for example, those research projects which have got the word gender in the proposal, they automatically disqualify from state funding. Or in the case of Hungary, recently from the curriculum from the secondary level education, they deleted the concept of gender. And of course, as a gender studies scholar, I immediately looked up the background material, and it turned out that originally they put gender studies and gender as an ideology in that curriculum. So without any consultation with gender studies professionals. So obviously those who put it there, they were already thinking about that there will be a moment when they can take it out, and then the gender studies scholars will be totally, not only marginalized, but they will be making a big noise, so we can, label them that they are the troublemakers and they are the bad scholars. So we should also think strategically and pick the fights where we are actually getting engaged, and we should have as much ties as possible with the policymakers and the politicians, which doesn't mean appeasement. This means dialogue and also trying to bring in our perspectives. And of course, gender studies scholars are tired of proving what is their added value and how they can make gender the scholarship better. But luckily, we have the Horizon 2020 Advisory Board in Brussels, where I also have the honor to serve, and we were actually trying to bring in gender as an important category. And it has been a long fight with kind of mixed results, but those who are applying for Horizon 2020 grants, they should make a statement about what is the gender component of their research. So, I mean, this is a bastion, so we should definitely, preserve.
Keep gender very much on the agenda.
We should keep that, yeah.
So, Professor Pető, especially when we're under threat of resurgent nationalism and the anti-gender movement, which is part and parcel of that, how important is it that gender scholars work together internationally and transnationally? Is that part of the solution?
I think that is an important part of the solution, because the anti-gender movements, those political forces which are using gender as a mobilization against human rights, they are acting globally. They are acting globally, but also in the national context. So if you see a kind of anti-gender poster in Spanish, you can be sure that this will be translated in a week to Slovak or to Estonian or to Russian. So in this context, also the gender studies scholars should somehow network and cooperate and collaborate. And since feminism is a transnational global movement, I don't think that we have to invent the warm water. We just have to make sure that we are consciously and strategically using the resources we already have.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Andrea Pető. It's been a real privilege to have this chance to speak to you and for you to share your ideas, your experience, and your strategies for the future. And we hope we can go forward together and work together against this anti-gender movement. Thank you very much for coming to the University of Sheffield especially.
Thank you.